are the female entities of the ohia. And so the kuka ohia laka is representative of the trunk of the tree, the male energy of the ohia, where Hinaulu ohia is more representative of the things that grow on the ohia, like the ie, and they support each other. And so the ie here, we can see it's kind of climbing on top of the ohia, and it goes as it gets higher and higher and higher than the ie sprouts, and then we can't really see the flowers here. But the image here, what I want us to think about as we're having this conversation is more so around what we can see at top and what we cannot see. Yeah, and so similarly here, we can see the green, right, of the ear, and it's very bright. It's, it catches our eye. And sometimes and if we follow that line, right, with how lives are remembered, moʻolelo, what gets written down, what doesn't get written down, to get to what is the foundation, right, like the ohia, that then provides the foundation for the ie to come out, right? And so as we're having the conversation, why I named it Breaching the Archive is when we breach the ie, so to speak, right? We get to kind of uncover what's underneath it, right? And what that foundation is. And remember those lives that get lost in time, right? As things go. And how do we bring that back? And what does that mean when we bring things back? We're going to be talking about life writing broadly. I'm probably going to talk about life writing in a historical sense, but writing it into the contemporary. And the things that kind of come along with that. But yeah, I took this a little bit down. But let's move to the next. Oh yeah. And then for people on the Zoom, if you folks have questions, I think they can just drop it
in the chat.
Drop it in the chat, and then we can answer it.
Yeah.
So Craig, I wanted to ask you, could you just broadly talk about life writing so that everybody has a base understanding of the term.
Okay. We've got a couple of weeks. Just really briefly, and you should know I was in on a area examination with a PhD area examination yesterday, where is a Kānaka Maoli scholar and doing life writing. Oh, that's what we were talking about yesterday. And so I'll just move fairly quickly through. The terms that most of you will be familiar with are biography or autobiography. And if you take a look at the term biography, it's bio as in life and graphy as in writing, like graphics, okay? So life writing. Right, and autobiography is describing the life of a car. No, it's self-writing. Okay, so you're writing it's your life written by yourself. Now, I point to two things here, which are I'm foregrounding these because of where our discussion is going. First of all, the privileging of the notion of writing as alphabetic, sequential, and pala and so on and so forth. And we know there's a history in Hawaii of a kind of gift or imposition or curse or whatever you want to look at it in terms of literacy, which if you think of the word literacy, it's got letters right into it. And it's again talking about writing. So for a long time, when people talked about studying this, they would talk about nonfiction, tended to be in literary studies. So some kind of a true narrative about people's lives, and assuming it would be biographies and autobiographies, all right? There's an exceptionally long tradition of these being important texts. If you think about it, all of Christianity is based on 4 biographies about a guy that there's no other historical record for whatsoever, called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all right? If you also think about the Bible, it's largely a collection of genealogies and the stories of individual lives, right? So that notion running through Christian theology and Judaic theology, then also comes together with Roman, Greek, Western, right? All of those narratives as well too. But essentially what you're looking at is the writing down of lives, usually of quote, important people or people who somehow or other became important. All right. When we moved into the 1960s and 70s, though, this notion of the sort of great man or great woman seems so tied to the notion of biography and autobiography that when people started trying to think about writing or representing the lives of people who weren't some-bodied, all right, the term didn't seem to help as much. So that what started happening was it was describing the practice more than the kind of writing down. So it became life writing, because then it became a matter of, all right, now it expands into a much wider range. So for example, whereas autobiography and biography suggest books, life writing can suggest oral history. It can suggest genealogy. It can suggest, as we move forward, biopics. In other words, any way that lives are recorded, reached, or represented. So life writing became the term, and especially the time when, to quote the motto of ethnic studies, it became much more our history, our way. And that recording of lives became much more involved in trying to catch individuals who were significant, not in a kind of worldly sense, but within their own community or within their own family, and so on and so forth. Right? So life writing became the term for describing that. Now that's changed even since then because of that privileging of the idea of writing that I mentioned earlier, right? So that what you get now is more life narrative. The idea that what you're recording are stories. And if you look at the brochure for today, you'll notice, especially in Indigenous life writing, which we'll get to in a bit, there's the emphasis on the life doesn't even necessarily have to be a person. If you think of Daniel Heath Justice's work and talking about, or mountain people, or the notion of somehow or other representing the course or the events that take place in relation to a particular individual, not necessarily human, in a particular place. So you can see retroactively how this will extend everything into everything that's inaccurately described as myth or legend. So life writing more generally, or life narrative, tends to be this model, this huge covering for any way that a life is represented, right? And furthermore, with an emphasis on narrative, on story, on moʻolelo as being sort of crucial for that. So that refusal to distinguish between fiction and nonfiction, which is fundamental to moʻolelo, basically suggests that moʻolelo itself is in some ways a plain equivalent to the notion of life writing. Right. So I'll just stop there with the further about that. But what it really does is it moves it expands the range of what lives can be represented, and it also expands the kinds of ways that that can be done in terms of genre. It could be a book, it could be an article, it could be a chant. It could be a genealogy. It could be a biopic. It could be a self-portrait. And then we start wondering, are we really talking about narrative now? But anyway, it has to do with the representation or recognition of life in some way that is presented.
A couple of things that I want to grounding it more so towards Indigenous, how we think about it in Indigenous terrain for Kānaka Maoli. I think when we think of life as well as the human and the more than human, inclusive of our plants, animals, land, to remember the life or the memory, the things that have happened perhaps in a single place over time, right? And how people, kupuna, others have documented those things, the different types of modalities, right? Craig briefly mentioned some through mele, right? If it's a chant, different kinds of chants. If it is a millenia, a genealogical chant for a certain kind of chief. If it's a Kanaka, right? If you're memorializing the life of a person and their death, and that's a whole other thing. And then also through moʻolelo and the various kinds of moʻolelo that there are, the broad swath, the spectrum, that could be understood as memoir and others. But one thing that I wanna focus on to Craig's point about the issue of writing alphabetic literacy is that we also need to remember the continuity between oracy, the oral tradition, and moʻolelo and the writing, and that moʻolelo and life writing, life narrative, right, doesn't begin conception of alphabetic literacy in Hawaii, but it just becomes a another step, right? Another notch in the evolution of, and not in a modernity way, but in the evolution of how narrative expanded here in Hawaii, and so because if you look at the very, very early moʻolelo that were published, you'll see how they weren't very, very long. Yeah, they weren't, the prose, how it was developed, it didn't run for 4 years, like some stories later on that you might find, in the 19th century. But some of the early versions, like one of the early accounts of the moʻolelo Maoli, it's very short, succinct, 2 installments maybe, and it was like this happened and this happened and then this happened. There wasn't a ton of peppering throughout the moʻolelo, and it was very, very close to how it may have been told in homes. Yeah, and as the tradition evolved, right, and then people start to adopt different kinds of styles, and let me talk about this thing more. I'm gonna now add what I think this thing should mean and what people should walk away with these things. And so in kind of that way, as we're talking about memory, documenting, and writing a life, it's also this reciprocal and co-constitutive process. It becomes that way, right? Because now you have writers that are writing themselves into the moʻolelo, including and building off of the moʻolelo that was handed to them, by their parents, by their grandparents, by their families. So they're inheriting a tradition, right, that was added into by the people that came before them, and then they add themselves into that tradition. And every single time, and Kamalani talks about this in his book too, and every single time, and his analytic of the Manoli, but every single time it's told, every single time it gets redone in different ways. Every time it gets translated, it gets added into this reservoir of moʻolelo and the mana, the power, and the versions that get added into there increase. Yeah, and so I think to that point, I think it's important, for us to remember the through line and the continuity when we think about life narrative, especially here in Hawaii, which can be also applied to other indigenous communities as well. And then today, we kind of the through line pulling back here today now, there's such a people are focusing on moʻolelo, and there's a community of people that are very focused on defining what moʻolelo is in very, very in kind of box, and putting it into certain kinds of definitions. But that's one way to think about it. But I also think what we need to remember is how fluid literary categories were and they were very permeable. If it was a Kanaka and it kind of bled into and overlapped with other kinds of compositions, and they were those things and none of those things sometimes, yeah. And so moʻolelo functions in that same way, and so following that tradition of the permeable membrane of moʻolelo today, right, in our contemporary situation, people are doing this and continuing this work in so many different ways, right? Through poetry, right? Through media, through film, through art, illustrations, animation, all sorts of things. And I think if our kupuna had access to some kinds of technologies, they probably would have did it too. Yeah, they probably would. If they had video, they probably would have done it. If they had audio in those ways, in the ways that we do now, they probably would have taken advantage of it too. So I think for me, I'd like to advocate for a more expansive understanding of what moʻolelo is, and more so moʻolelo as I think I used the word reservoir. Kind of like a reservoir of memories and experiences. And when you have access to that key, right, and the key that allows you to tap into that reservoir, that this idea of ancestral memories that Kamalani talks about, other people have kind of expanded on that along those lines of that similar idea, right? And as every time we access it, right, we pull it out, and we write it again, we story it again, and we narrate it again. The things that I'm interested in, which we have some questions in here that are along those lines, are when we access whatever it is, the life, the memory, something that has been storied before, I'm interested more so in the questions and decisions that come with accessing that particular memory in life that you pulled, right? And so what kinds of questions are we asking? Am I the right person to pull that memory, to pull that life, to story it again? And if I'm not the right person, then what, right? If it is perhaps, for people that are interested in researching about the life of a writer or a person or a figure in history that may have served in a particular position, maybe it was Kane of Wahine, a man or a woman of a certain way, their ohana, their land, their aina, where they came from. If you don't have a relationship to that, like what does that mean, right? Like, do we just can we? So these are some questions that we want to be asking, but that's just one example, right, of a life narrative, life writing project, right? And so I think for people that are here physically and on the Zoom, right, I mean, have some kind of interest in life writing, whatever modality that is, right? If you are writing poetry, if you're a poet, things that you're thinking about as you're composing. If you are interested in Hawaiian language newspapers and Hawaiian English newspaper work, some things that you might want to be asking, right, as you're accessing things. Or maybe you may be interested in reconstructing a life, who a figure was and what kinds of things are you looking for to be able to say certain things definitively about their story. I think these are things that we want to keep to mind.
Yeah, what I'd suggest is that, and it ties into that notion of narrative, that it's rather than thinking of life writing as an end in itself, that's the project, it often makes more sense of thinking of it as a means to a particular end. That where you're going. In other words, you're asking the question, so what? Rather than sort of just having the archiving and the telling of the story sort of take over. And we like stories, right? And there is something to be argued for, a lot to be argued for stories that are there largely to entertain, although they might have some other background. the work I'm doing in Aloha, Hawaii is not surprisingly on the translations from Western sources into there, because I have no business doing stuff on Hawaii-centered material, but to quote Liam Neeson, I have a certain set of skills in that I'm a specialist in 19th century European periodical literature, so I'm far more likely to recognize what they're translating and finding it interesting as to why. And you probably know about a quarter to a third of all Hawaiian language newspapers is made up of translations of Western text. And a lot of them are biographies. All right. But in addressing that, I'm going to go over something just really quickly as another example of how this might work in that notion of means to an end. When Noe Silva was doing her work, and especially when she moved to the second book, we were bouncing ideas back and forth about this because she realized she was getting sucked into doing a lot of biographical work to be able to do these materials. So it became a question of, all right, that's, I'm in political science. I'm not writing biographies of these people. You do that over in the English department. That's why you've got Aloha Lani Brown and Tiffany Ng and those books, right? So what she figured out was, as a kind of Western term to describe it, the dupe or whatever, was that she was doing biobibliographies. And that's the term she uses for that. And what it means is her larger project, as we know, tied heavily to how consciousness and whatever, her major project is to uncover and demonstrate the richness of continuity of the Hawaiian intellectual tradition. But there's not just 4 or 5, 4K is this course of sufficiency. There's literally hundreds of incredibly smart and productive individuals who are in conversation with each other and basically covering the entire range of human knowledge everywhere from London to Washington, right? And so she found that, okay, that's huge, all right? So how do you navigate that? How do you start gesturing people toward, because I've been talking about the second book is the book that will launch 1,000 dissertations, because there are so many suggestions as to what would be interesting to follow up on in her work. And what she did was she used, right, Kanipu'u and Poipoi as basically organizational loci, because she knew these people were hardcore intellectuals who were unimaginably productive in a whole range of areas, so that to follow and figure out what they wrote and what they produced and what kind of communities that they were engaged in is a way of providing a kind of preliminary organization of what does the Hawaiian intellectual environment look like at that time. And if you look at that book, that's very much the way she's presented it. Many of us are familiar with the famous quotation from Kanipu'u about, print all of the chants because they're going to want this in 1870 and 1880 and 1980. She's contributing to that and acknowledging that and recognizing that imperative from the kupuna to do that, so that the life writing dimension, using them as initial organizational principles for organizing a range of material that she knows will be very rich. And even then, when you look at her book, you'll see, okay, I'm ruling out the translations. This guy did 5,000 words of translation every single week for 40 years, as far as we can consider. So, for example, when Poipoi is doing Pele and Hi'iaka, he's also doing Marie Corelli's 3 Lovers, 1 Woman, and translating them simultaneously at the same time, right? So that, and familiarity with intellectual history, these people are not just bilingual, they are bicultural in a way that is unimaginably profound. So in this particular case, thinking of life writing, and this actually extends over to Kamalani's work, life writing is a portion of the way that he is organizing his investment, and I hope he talks more about that project. It's very strongly there, but it's the means to get to that kind of engagement, to raise those kind of questions from a particular point of view of the kind that he's been just mentioning in the last few minutes. So the only point I'd make here is that life writing can be thought of as a means to an end. And increasingly also the notion of having to situate yourself in relation to your work. So there's a lot of work going on notions of autofiction or auto theory. The idea of a kind of objectivity which somehow or other strips your actual nature away from the material that you're working on, and even if you're mandated to do that. One of the things that life writing adds to this, without turning everything into being about you, is the notion of you have to indicate to people where you're situated, which of course is a major component of Indigenous theory, which is why those two things often tend to coincide.
One of the things, Douglas said that I wanted to talk about in relation to Noy's work, of course, and the intellectual communities, and of course between these relationships, intellectual relationships, between people like Poipoi and Kanaka, in the preface of Poipoi's moʻolelo Hawaii Kahiko, a word that he uses, which I really love, to explain intellectual communities for him, and why what it really necessitated the publication of moʻolelo Hawaii Kahiko is, he was saying that all these foreign people that have come into Hawaii have begun to construct this Western consciousness of Kanaka in Hawaii, writing histories about Kanaka, right? And he was very aware of those things, and to him, he was seeing all these histories written, and then he cites, Kamaka and others that have written things, and that they came before Poipoi. And he said that to really uplift the moʻolelo of Hawaii, we need to gather everything together, the things that have been published, the things that are in the newspapers, the things that are not, and really put them in a narrative to be able to hold it against these things and to show that Hawaii has this very strong foundation. And so the word, though, that he uses to reference the community of thinkers like Kamaka and others, he calls them a pohai. And some people today, might use, if you're like a circle of people, friends, whatever, people might just say pohai, which is a circle, right? But he uses the word pohai, and pohai references how people can circle together. It also references, you'll see it often in imagery related to birds and the way that birds fly and in circles, together though. And what I really like his idea, and a lot of people are using the model, collectives after collectives after collectives these days, right? And a lot of different things, right? But what does it even mean, right? What is the collective? And what when we say collective, what does that actually, right? And some, trying to uplift that up in certain circles in the business sector, I've seen it, others, they'll kind of call it a hala, right? Evoking those kinds of educational systems that you'll see in hula schools, right? With the power, with the kumu and their students, their haumana. And for me, when I was thinking about Poipoi's notion of pohai, right? What he's also invoking is that everyone has a foundation that they're standing on. When they're coming to that circle, right? That circle that's constantly moving, and that's what he's talking about as well. That the circle of thinkers is it's active, it's moving, it's animated, and also perhaps the range, the spectrum of competencies that each person in that pohai has will range, but by virtue of being in the pohai, they are strengthened, right, in a lot of ways. And I think for me, what I take away from that too is that the idea of the pohai is for a member to leave the pohai to then create more, Yeah, to create more pohai and they're beginning the cyclical process, right? Of being in one, and then when a person has a certain level or a foundation, they branch off and create another and create another and create another. And so for Noinoi to be able to be talking about those things in her work is really critical for the work that she did, especially in the part of the CO2 and to Craig's point about the book that launched that will launch 1,000 dissertations, mine is one. You know, mine is one of those, right? Thinking about that in please. But for me, one of those people that I'm looking at is JWHI Kihe. Just finished writing. I got it. Then that is another thing, right? And when we talk about life writing, you know, I think it's important for us to remember historical life writing and what that is, and then also contemporary life writing and its continuity to what we are doing today. Because I think sometimes for people, there's such a focus on the archives and this placing of the work of the 19th and early 20th centuries on this unattainable pedestal that Kanaka today can't possibly reach. But to that point, I think it's important for us to realize that the work that they were doing in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's the through line that connects to the work that we do today, and that through line is what Noinoi is talking about, where she calls it moʻolelo consciousness. And so for Kihe, right, like the things that I've had to I think I just explained how I got it, right? But it was when I was doing my BA, I had come across a moʻolelo of his that was written. I didn't really find a lot written about Kihe himself. And then I had asked, you know, some mentors of mine at the time, you know, if they knew who this person was, and people didn't really know. They're like, oh, I don't know. And then I started to, you know, research further, compile things further, and then I came across the story, and I was like, this thing is huge. Like, why didn't anybody do it? And then I decided to compile it, edit it all together. It's like 189 installments, and then I decided to make a typescript of the 189 installments, which then is about like 800 pages out of space, which is a lot. And then I realized that this is what nobody did because it's too much. It is a big project. That's what people are like, yeah. But to that point that, you know, when we see those things, you'll see how immense that intellectual tradition is. And to add, for me, my project with Kihe is bringing and remembering a whole nother thought world, right? In addition to that of people like Poi and Kaneka, and every single person who's moʻolelo, we can bring back into our contemporary, right? That's a whole thought world we now bring back and represent, right, in the continuity of our moʻolelo. Yeah.
Just a quick point on that dimension. May wonder if a biography has been done, why do you need another one? Right? I mean, the joke in my field is there have now been 84 biographies of Virginia Woolf done. But the important thing to follow up on Kamalani's point is that these biographies are not written for the subject. They're written for the time that they're being written. So who somebody is changes every 20 years, not because what happened or what they did change, but why our interests are on them. All right. Why do they tend to be important? And Poi is a good example because with each change or with each interest, you find out he did stuff along those lines. I've been lucky enough to know something about Kamalani's project, and it's the same kind of situation. He's having to decide which things am I going to foreground and which things am I going to put in the background, because there's just so much going on here. And you know that down the road, having access to that material might lead someone else who is far more, let's say, interested in the legal dimensions of this to then work in that area. So life writing is also aware of the fact that these lives are not for the people who live them anymore. They're for the people who are trying to understand what and answer that question, so what? And often the answer is incredibly rich.
And I think to my project, I think when I decided to go about the project, and I think it was in Frank's life writing seminar at the time. The question I was asking was, okay, how would I methodologically, how would I do that? And so what I did was I had everything, I literally have a Google sheet of every single thing that was written about Pili, that he wrote himself, and I constructed it chronologically. All these things that happened in his life, right? That would be his life in a Google sheet. That is like 500 rows deep, yeah, of his life, right? And then you're like, then after that, you're like, okay, what do I do now? Right? And you're like, okay, then you see, oh, okay, this was his upbringing, raised by his grandparents, in Kānaka. He was trained in these things, and then he was a substitute teacher. He was incarcerated twice, and then this happened, and this happened, and then he went into his phase of publishing moʻolelo for the rest of his life. And so there's a lot of, as Craig is saying, these decisions that we need to make in the contemporary, right? Like, what do I write about? What do I not write about? What do I focus on, right? And perhaps also too, the kuleana and ethics, if we're going to use that word, of representing certain things of his life, right? Like, if I'm just saying, if I was incarcerated 2 times, I don't know, like, is that, and those are things I have to think about, like, if I was here, and those are questions that I was asking myself. If I was here, would I want that part of my life to be talked about? I don't know, and so each person, when we do this kind of work, whether it is biobibliography or not, right? I think it's important that we have a series of questions that we might ask ourselves. And for me, what was important was and this was a personal thing that I did throughout my graduate studies during my MA. I did my MA on some stuff on Pili as well as my PhD now. But having a relationship with his owner, right, with his family, with his descendants, and that's the thing that I do. And it's not a thing that everybody does. If somebody is going to write about a certain person, that they reach out and have an active relationship with that family. And for me, I was very fortunate that I knew that I went to college with one of his descendants, and being in conversation, that process of, hey, this is what I'm doing, and what do you think about what I'm doing, right? In a Western academic sense, right? I mean, like, I don't need to consult in that way, that every step of the way. But for me, in a Hawaiian way, right? In a Hawaiian and indigenous way, it's critical for me to have that ongoing relationship that they know what I'm accessing, how I'm representing, and sometimes the hard part is that parts of their kupuna's life that I know about that they don't know about. Yeah. So there's this odd way that it's as an interlocutor between these times and this life and now, and teaching them about their kupuna, which is very, very hard. But having those open lines, right, of communication.
Yeah, and that's a fundamental difference, and it's tied into notions of research methodologies, right? Yeah, Linda Dewey-Smith makes a lot of this, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that book. But if you look at the end, after describing the extractive force of research, and the kind of abuse that is almost hardwired into the notion of Western research. You'll remember at the end, she has, here's 25 projects that it seems to me would be ethical for people to do. If you look at them, 20 of them are life writing projects. They're all involved in navigating, and of course, she has that wonderful example where she decided her first round of this when she was in a creche, right, and a group of mothers with babies, and it was and primarily Maori mothers with babies, and so she decided what I want to do is find out how that's working. She sort of put her academic hat on, and I'm already in the creche and I'm part of it, so it'll work fine. Then she started asking the people in the creche questions, and she suddenly found out, oh, it's like they're looking at the hat, right? They're looking at the researcher hat and wondering, what am I going to do with this? Why are you asking about this? And so on and so forth. So the example I give, because I did a lot of work in 19th century literature. A number of years ago, I worked with Victoria Newell and a number of people on a television series called Biography of Hawaii. And we did a documentary on Joseph Navahi. And one of the funders asked, have you been in contact with the family? Now, in fact, we had, actually then got more in touch as we moved forward along the way. But I realized, you know, coming from my research background, this would be the equivalent, because he died the same year, of asking, you know, the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, have you talked to her family? Never crossed my mind, right? So that notion of, and this is where that overlay and why, and this is part of what I'd say, one of the things I've tried to introduce in is the really profound impact that Indigenous methodology and Indigenous research practices are having on the way that people should be thinking about life writing. Because often that notion of responsibility to your subjects and whatever is really not built in. And I'll stop here, but you know, that notion that biography above all is the ultimate violating academic practice led James Joyce to refer to biographers as biographies. And it's hard to imagine a more extractive form of research than going in and wanting to grab other people's lives. And so much of ethnography and whatever amounts to that, and that's why Tuhubai Smith's book is so important from a life writer perspective.
Yeah, to that point about how extractive it is, right? When you go, in my work, what I found that's violating in certain ways is like, you're essentially going into their brain or their metal of sorts, right? And you're like, okay, what's in here, right? And like, oh, that's in there, okay. Now there's like this scaffolding that you start to understand, and you're like pulling it apart to then put it back together again, right? And so for me, to be able to do that to another life takes, there's a billion questions that I ask myself on the daily, but I think what I found is the relationship with the people that, you know, are from the same place as this person that I'm invested in, as well as his family. Those are the things that kind of ground and pull me out, right? And be like, okay, it's cool. What you're doing is, it's fine, you know, and kind of all those anxieties and the questions kind of dissipate when you are in a pohai of sorts with others to be able to talk about it, right? Specifically his pohana, his descendants, and how they thought about him. One of the things to these people, Kihe, Koi, Kaipu, and others. There's one in on July 4th, 1924, and I'm sure we're going to look for that as an example. He writes from Ponauno, from Paleoquiave, and ironically and not ironically, it's July 4th, right? And so there's a celebration that's happening, all sorts of people are there. His family, other Hawaiians that are from that area, and he also lists some friends. There are lots of Japanese, Chinese living in the area as well. So everybody's well worked, everybody, they're dancing hula, and he kind of writes about all the things that were done. And he writes that as he's sitting down, he illustrates this memory. He's looking out to Haleokiawe, and then he begins to recollect the moʻolelo of Kamehameha, right? And he starts to, he starts with Haleokiawe, and then the immediate next detail is he's like, I want to talk about this hewa that I'm thinking about, right? And he talks about what Kamaka has written about in terms of the creation of the Aupuni, of Hawaiian governance and government. And he talks about the Ava ceremony with Kamehameha and Kipala'o and the Apu Ava. But my point here is that, and he says that, and everybody's like having fun, laughing, around him. Think about Hawaiian governance. Looking out at the Haleokiawe, right? And that member that Haleokiawe and in that aina on Honau is what conjured that life and that memory that was within Kihei, right? Because he was himself, a historian of sorts, storyteller. And in a conversation that I had with Kalini Umiva, she tells me, actually what I think, to me, what I think he is that he's a kahuna moʻolelo, is that he was a keeper of various genealogies. And throughout his life, that was his project, right? His project was speaking truth to power wherever that was, because Kihei throughout his life often, had a pulse on all the, political proceedings, legislative proceedings, and if certain senators and whatnot, were making a promise to their constituents that they would fight for them, especially if they were haole then. And they did the opposite. Then Kihei would write about it. He would take to the newspapers and say, hey, people, this is what you voted for. And they promised to do this, but they actually voted this way. So you should not vote them in. So he did that. He followed all the proceedings. And so to Kale's point, to Kale's point about kahuna moʻolelo, right? Like what I'm interested in the how, like when we actually do that day to day, if somebody says something that goes against, this thing that you believe in, and despite the politics and what you might lose, right? The risk of that in practice is hard, right? And for a person like Kihei who lived in rural Kona, he didn't move to Honolulu. He wasn't in a big city, although he was in Kānaka. And he after incarceration, he lost a lot, and most of a lot, And so to be able to actually put truth to that word, and I'm going to stand up to these wrongdoings, no matter what the cost, I think there's a lot of lessons for us today. But my last point about that is just that how the body is a reservoir, is a vessel for memories, right? And so for Kihei, when he was at Honau, right, these things were already in him, right? The moʻolelo of Kamehameha, other writers who lived before him, like Kamaka and Pili, who had written about these things, these people that were related to the aina that he lived in, the memory of that aina. And being at Kaleokawe, looking out, being at Honolulu, looking out at Kaleokawe was the thing that conjured that memory that was already there in him to then get him to talk about it. And then by him talking about it, and then kind of my process and how I like the next notch in that talking about it, bringing that out again to us today. Like, oh, like 115 years old. So I think to the point of life narrative, right? There's a continuity, no matter how we do it, right? And multiple how is that in its broadest sense, multiple how is that through. Right?
Yeah, I would just suggest, which I guess is a good thing, that this has been the exact opposite of extracted and that we've just been putting stuff on you. So my suggestion would be, because we said it was going to be a conversation, would it be okay if we actually open it up?
Absolutely.
Make sure we can get this.
Yeah, does anybody in visiting us virtually have questions? Please share in the chat.
Question?
Or comments.
Somebody else.
Yeah,
Because I think about the EE that we had in the beginning, and then all this talk of Nupepa, and how Nupepa, like the EE as a sign of a thriving forest, right? And at that time, Nupepa was able to really congeal, and therefore kind of build together. But now when we're talking about this idea of life narrative, which is broader, and uses a variety of them. Is there a point where, like now, I guess EE is already wild, but it's actually more a hue.
Yeah. That's a person.
You know what I mean? So like, is there, like when we look at this EE as it's grown or through time, is there times where you like recognize that they've been strong? And where is the EE possibly healthy now? Like in a world that is, or in a Hawaii that's experiencing genocide and then fake facts. And then the idea of coin is a holy word. We have this life narratives that are all acute. And also like, yeah, how do you, I don't know, control that for us, maybe? Or do you?
I'll give one example. We did a special issue on the Maui. And it was Kamali Kuwata and Milton. And if you look at that, what you see is that a lot of it is oral history or autobiography. You know, it's Noe Bigger who are talking about what it was like to chain herself to the fence, or it was interviewed. But the way that they focused it, because of course that would be astoundingly huge as well too. They focused it in on the life narratives of the people who realized their responsibility was to get the actual narratives of what was going on the mauna from the people there, rather than what was being imposed upon them. Right? And the whole Kanaka and the business of broadcasting live or whatever, a lot of that was actually countering official statements about drunkenness and drugs and et cetera, by immediately being able to respond with life narratives, with interviews, with oral histories of the people who were actually living there in the moment. So I think one thing there is that notion of life narrative isn't just about trying to reclaim the past. It's sometimes being able to monitor or put forward under a circumstance of what's going on right now. That we have to hear those stories now as a counter to the stories that are being imposed upon us. So that I think that's one kind of extension. So it worked out that most of the oral histories were the whoever was operating there, they were largely interviews of the people that were struggling to get those stories out. And who was doing the interviews, and also recognizing that the experience of individual people were different. All right, so that, for example, as you know, in addition to creating, the university there, to continually keep reminding people that that was going on, there were also safe areas being set up for mahu and women and whatever to respond again to the way that some of these stories seem to be unfolding. So I think it's one of the things that Indigenous life writing provides so strongly. The very fact that you call attention that this life is being lived is an implicit or often an explicit response to the way that it's being represented.
Hmm.
On that, to answer your question more from like historical, like in terms of like, you know, because there are, I think earlier I used phrase like how Potboy was contending with this proliferating Western discourse of Kānaka Maoli, right? As opposed to a Kānaka Maoli consciousness of Kānaka Maoli, right? Which the through line is moʻolelo that have been passed intergenerationally, from generation to generation, right? And our kupuna, you know, those writers, various people, whether they did contribute epic, you know, things, you know, very, very long, or just people that wrote, you know, here and there, I'm adding here and there, or just like I'm selling my crown, you know. That they were aware of this Western discourse, yeah, that was proliferating, and they wrote. Yeah, they wrote, they composed, they told stories. Yeah, they continued to do those things over the course of the 19th and the early 20th century, which is kind of the period that I'm focusing on, kind of unmooring all of the politics of that era. But I think one of the things we can do today is to write, to tell stories, right? So that it's told again, right? So that it's written again, and indigenous communities, Kanaka communities have a long history of that, and that can be applied broadly as well. I think for me, the thing we have to be asking is what the foundation of your writing is, right? And who are you writing for? And what is your writing? And when I'm saying writing, I'm saying any kind of documentation, right? If you are designing, if you are an artist, if you are a poet, right? If you are a TV host, if you are whatever it is, whatever your modality of life narrative is, you know, what at the root of your practice, right, is what is motivating you, and to whom are you accountable to and for? I think those are questions we want to ask, and that'll kind of provide some insight as to the direction, right, where you're going, where you're going to, you know.
These, by the way, are questions that everybody should be asking about all their research, even if they're in STEM. What life writing tends to do is call your attention to the fact, because you are working with the notion of positionality all of the time, so that it's inescapable, as Kamalani has been pointing out. You're going to question your own positionality in relation to this narrative, simply because you're trying to position the narrative. And where are you standing from? Right? It's like that notion of autoethnography, right? Which can mean two completely different things. Autoethnography can mean you are part of the community that is being studied or recorded for various reasons. Or it can mean you need to know where you're standing in relation to that community. Yeah. So that there isn't that shield of saying, well, I'm being objective, that's why I don't have to be personally invested or revelatory in relation to doing my research, right? And I think one of the things life writing does, and why it has such an overlay a lot with indigenous studies, queer studies, and whatever, is it's drawing on people who are continually aware of the fact that they have to position themselves and recognize where they are.
One more.
This idea of life writing them, and then life writing the people that participate in life writing in the academy. Like I write for bush naturals. Like, you know, like I write a pigeon for people in the bushes because that's where I'm from. Right? And right. But then as we try and get some sort of credibility through the academy, like I think of like people like Agambe and Mabembe, who are setting us free in the most complex words that if you're from the bushes, you can't read it because what did this page that say? right? Like, how, yeah, each of you navigate that, like in that question of who is this for? Who is this for? But I'm here in this system that requires a certain level of participation in oppressive networks in order to get certified, right? Like, so I don't know how you guys navigate that.
You get tenure?
Because I can't even get a job.
No, I can tell you, it actually worked out. I didn't take over the editorship of biography until I was a full professor because I knew I would get no credit for it. All right, I know I don't get any academic credit for doing living history and pretending I've been every single racist part of the overthrow. I don't, and without it's going to some way to Greg. It's that notion of we're all versatile, we're all doing various kinds of things. If you think of Paola Osorio, right? She's a spoken word poet. She's also a high-end theoretical writer. She's also on the mount, you know, but you do, and you're absolutely right. You need to be to a certain degree, either in a position where you made the kind of sacrifices that Kamalani's talking about for Pihei, or you have to recognize that your ability to do various things is actually the result of privilege and that you're having to negotiate that all the time. You know, so for example, yes, there were pressures on me producing academic stuff, but I also got a tuition waiver, which is how I ended up as a student in a little Hawaii. All right, I mean, and that notion of recognizing you don't have to lock yourself into one thing, because what the academy also tends to do is suggest that if you're really going to do something serious, you should not pay attention to anything else, including your family. Right? And that notion of how you navigate those things, how you find ways of doing different things, right? And recognizing that you can write theoretical stuff, but you can also do other stuff. Maoli Kuwata was lucky enough to be involved in his dissertation, right? And hardline theorist, incredibly brilliant theorist, but at the same time, when he was working with Kanaka or whatever, that impulse of recognizing I've got to make this somehow or other relevant to other people. So if I can't figure out how if I can't figure out how to turn my high-end theoretical work into a children's book, there might be something problematic.
I think to Kirk's point, there's all sorts of mediums, right, and how we're gonna communicate what we're trying to communicate. And I think that we have to decide what we would like the work to do, right? And similar to Maoli, you know, I think for me in terms of honey moʻolelo, there's various ways to do that, right? And if my audience are Hawaii speakers, you know, I'm gonna develop that. I'm going to turn that highly theoretical thing into something where I can talk to somebody about. You know, like it's gonna be a talk show. You know, but where you're sitting with people and we're having a conversation about it, you know, and we're having underlying and through all of it is that high theory, but we can talk about it as if we are we're talking about it through a practice. If we're talking about hula, if we're talking about money and whatever it is, but it's all underlaying all of those things, and I think that speaks to the point of, you know, the proliferating discourses, and we need to do it in so many different ways. If that's a children's book, if that's a show of sorts, if that is, you know, this right here, this speaker series, you know, a dissertation, a book, all these things, and the more of those things that we have that are rooted in a certain foundation, with a certain thought way and thought world embedded into it, the more mana it'll have. So,
Mahalo. I think that's our time. Mahalo to everybody for coming, and mahalo to you folks on Zoom for coming and joining us. Yes, let's eat. Ma.